I do realize that I'm standing between you guys and lunch, and what probably won't surprise Bob is I've got a lot to say as well. So I'm going to be talking today about socioeconomic and institutional dimensions of coral reef co-management. So here's the plan. We'll start with a background on the sort of transition towards collaborative or co-management. Then we'll provide some common property perspectives on what makes for successful co-management arrangements. And then I'll present some preliminary results from a study that's literally hot off the processor on co-management institutions in 5 countries. So throughout the Indo-Pacific, communities are being increasingly empowered with the ability and responsibility of working with national governments and other stakeholders in making decisions about the governance of natural resources. This movement towards community-based or co-management has resulted in part from ideological perspectives that are sort of pro-poor and pro-participation, but also from the perceived failure of many top-down and open-access governance arrangements. A number of studies have found that top-down governance arrangements, such as national marine parks, have frequently proven unsuccessful, particularly in developing countries, because they disenfranchise and alienate key stakeholders, resulting in poor compliance and what we refer to as paper parks. So for decades, common property scholars have studied how people can collectively manage what we call common pool resources. Now, common pool resources are those that have 2 defining characteristics. They have what we call low excludability and high subtractability. Low excludability means, well, it's difficult to exclude people from it. It's hard to put a fence around a coral bommy in the middle of the sea. High subtractability means that if I take some, there's less left for you guys. And coral reefs are a very good example of this type of common pool resource. So common property theory suggests the crux of effectively managing these common pool resources is organizing users so that they adopt coordinated strategies to increase their joint benefits or reduce their joint harm, rather than acting independently. And a key part of this sort of organization or coordination of users is the development of locally appropriate rules that provide incentives for the resource users to invest in the resource rather than overexploit it. So by engaging communities in co-management, governments and conservation groups hope to make conservation initiatives more reflective of local conditions and consequently increase compliance. So these co-management ideas are thought to improve the incentives for sustainable resource use, but also increase the efficiency of fisheries management because both the actions and the decisions are occurring at the local level. Well, a number of these sort of co-management examples have proven effective at conserving marine resources. And sometimes these have prompted widespread replication by governments, by conservation groups, and sometimes by communities themselves. But often this sort of replication or this blueprinting has been done without a fundamental understanding of why co-management may be successful under some circumstances, but unsuccessful under others. So 2 main elements are thought to influence the success or failure of common property arrangements such as co-management. This includes the actual design or the architecture of the institution itself and the socioeconomic context within which this institution operates in. So for the first, to facilitate cooperation and avoid free riding, there are specific institutional design principles that are thought to create credible commitments that resource users will follow the rules. And the seminal work by Elinor Ostrom, who won this year's Nobel Prize in Economics, found there was common design characteristics shared by successful and long-enduring common property institutions. These include things like clearly defined geographic boundaries and membership rights, that resource users have the rights to make, enforce, and change the rules, that the people that are affected by the rules can participate in the process of getting those rules changed. We call these collective choice arrangements. That sanctions increase with repeat offenses or with the severity of offenses. We call these graduated sanctions because they gradually get harder. That there are effective conflict resolution mechanisms in place, and that these institutions are nested within other institutions to provide a degree of functional redundancy. Secondly, a number of theoretical studies, some case studies, and some comparative studies have found that whether people overexploit or successfully manage common property resources is critically related to the socioeconomic context that they operate in. And in particular, it relates to the number of users, how dependent people are on the resources, their levels of sort of social capital or the bonds within communities, whether they're wealthy or poor, how integrated people are into national and international markets, and people's knowledge about the social-ecological system. So despite the critical importance of common pool resources such as coral reefs and forestries to communities throughout the world, few studies have quantitatively examined relationships between these institutional designs, the socioeconomic conditions, and the success of these sort of common property arrangements increasingly being used to govern natural resources. A number of the studies to date have been either case studies or comparative studies confined to relatively small geographic boundaries. There's been little systematic effort to date to understand how contextual and institutional conditions influence the success of these co-management arrangements over broader spatial and social scales. And these types of broad comparative studies are critical to reveal the types of broad patterns that allow us to test and refine both our assumptions and our theories. So we collected socioeconomic, institutional, and ecological data from 42 sites throughout Kenya, Tanzania, Madagascar, Papua New Guinea, and Indonesia to explore the question, how are key dimensions of success in co-management related to this sort of institutional architecture and to the socioeconomic conditions that these communities operate in? Well, the first thing we need to do is sort of define what we mean by success. And to me, it's critical that we approach this as a multidimensional concept, right? So that a co-management arrangement can be successful at improving people's economic conditions. It can be successful at changing behaviors, such as removing destructive gears. And it can be successful at maintaining or improving ecological conditions. But I don't think we can necessarily start off with the assumption that these are collinear, that these are related, that just because something improves the ecology, that it's bad for people, or that it's good for people. As our previous speaker highlighted, there are other dimensions of success, such as improving access to resources. But today I'm just going to talk about these three. So we measured economic success is whether people perceived it had an impact on their livelihood, whether positive or negative. We looked at behavioral success as the level of perceived compliance with the co-management arrangement. Now, we didn't ask people whether they complied with it, but whether in general they thought the management system was being complied with. Now, I know some people have a sort of visceral reaction to asking, well, you can't just ask people about that. Well, there's two things. The first is that the places that we work in aren't world-renowned for transparency and record-keeping, right? So Kenya's not going to keep records of all these infringements in there, so you can't actually rely on those types of things. And the second, I want to refer you guys to a paper that's available online early in the Proceedings of the National Academy now, where we looked at this. We compared 56 marine reserves across the Caribbean, the Western Indian Ocean, and Southeast Asia. And we were able to use this metric of perceived compliance to predict the response ratio of fish biomass inside compared to outside of protected areas. So where people said people were not complying with it, we found that there was no difference of fish inside compared to outside. And where people said there was very good compliance, we were finding differences. And what this suggests is people are actually pretty good judges of whether people are complying with management or not. And lastly, we looked at the condition of harvested resources in terms of target fish biomass. So the couple of key points that we found here was that overall resource users felt like co-management was actually benefiting them on a scale of sort of -1 to 1. It was at about 0.5, so overall they had positive perceptions. Secondly, they felt like things were being relatively well complied with, but there were limited infringements happening there. And secondly, what we found was these different dimensions were not correlated. So because of the multi-level sort of structure of our data, this necessitated a hierarchical approach to make inferences about these factors that are operating at the different scales. And because of our different measures of success, we use three types of hierarchical models to quantify how our measure of success changed in relation to these design characteristics and the socioeconomic conditions. So I want to just present this sort of framework here that I'll go through to help us guide us through the sort of rest of the results as we go through them. So we've got our three dimensions of success: the institutional sort of architecture, the institutional designs, and the socioeconomic conditions in the communities. And I did want to point out that a couple of these were constant throughout our study, right? So all of the places we looked at actually were nested within other institutions, so that's the last you'll hear about those. So this figure shows how these socioeconomic characteristics and design principles influence compliance with fisheries co-management. An interpretation of this is somewhat similar to looking at effect size in a meta-analysis. Estimates that overlap the vertical line have high levels of uncertainty, whereas we've got strong evidence that, and sorry, these ones are indicated in gray, but estimates that don't overlap, we've got strong evidence that they have either positive or negative influences. So, for example, we've got strong evidence that high levels of trust, that dependence on marine resources as the primary occupation, and wealth measured as material style of life have strong positive influences. And I'll just briefly explain this material style of life. It's a measure of wealth that we can create, a multidimensional measure of wealth that we can create by looking at people's houses, so whether their house is made out of, whether it's got mud walls or cement walls, whether it's got a thatched roof or a metal roof, whether they've got a mobile phone and electricity, and we can use these indicators to construct a scale of wealth. So we've got strong evidence that there's a negative influence of compliance by things like having high levels of migration in the community. But also, interestingly, by having participation in community events and involvement in decision-making. Also by understanding that humans are causal agents of change in marine systems. So there's a couple of noteworthy results here when we go back to our framework. And the first is that there's a lack of consistent support for these design principles influencing compliance. Remember, these were thought of to create credible commitments that people would comply with the rules. And what we've actually found was that one of these design principles does relate to compliance, but it has a small negative influence on that. The second thing that we found was that people complied with rules better when they depended on marine resources and they had few livelihood alternatives. In short, people comply with the rules where their livelihoods depend on it. This is consistent with common property theory, but potentially at odds with a number of sort of integrated conservation and development ideas about providing alternative livelihoods. As we'll see throughout the next couple of talks, this is actually much more complicated than these sort of simplistic narratives about providing jobs to fishermen would like us to believe. And lastly, some of the other variables or covariates that we thought would have an influence on this actually don't, such as population. So we used a multinomial model to examine the impacts of co-management on people's livelihood, and we used neutral as our baseline. So what that means is we have two sets of estimates. One for what differentiates negative responses from neutral responses. So who are the losers in co-management, right? And a separate set of estimates from what differentiates positive responses from neutral responses. So who are the winners in co-management, right? So the first set of results, to find out who the losers are, we find that we only have strong evidence that one of these institutional design principles influences whether co-management has whether people have negative perceptions about co-management. And I realize this is a little bit complex because it's to the left there. This means that people are less likely to have negative perceptions about co-management where there's effective conflict resolution mechanisms in place. Right? So that doesn't mean that they're more likely to be positive, it just means they're less likely to be negative when these conflict resolution mechanisms are there. Alternatively, we have strong evidence that a number of design principles, that population, occupational diversity, and whether people believe that humans are causal agents of change in marine systems influences positive perceptions about co-management impacts on people's livelihoods. And this is sort of interesting because what we find is that we've got a much more complicated and a better recipe for success than we do for failure. We don't really understand what causes these things to fail so much, but we do actually have an idea of what causes these things to succeed. So again, just to summarize this using our framework, we see quite a difference between what influences this dimension of success and what influenced the previous dimension of success. Here, our economic dimension of success is influenced by the institutional architecture, these design principles, by small populations, and high levels of dependence on marine resources. So for our our variable of fish biomass, which was observations of which were at the community scale, we used multimodal inference to determine the variables of importance, and this led to a reduced set of parameters to the others. And so we've organized these on the left by the Bayesian posterior model estimates, which is indicated as WI. So it goes from top being the most important to bottom being the least important. And I think there's two things that are worth pointing out here. We have the strongest evidence that the biggest influence on fish biomass is the quadratic function of this wealth indicator, this material style of life indicator. These results are broadly consistent with a study we did with a completely different data set in different countries and presented last year. The weakest evidence that we have is for population. So again, just to summarize these results very briefly, we see measurable changes in fish biomass with this quadratic function of material style of life, where there's levels of migration, where people are dependent on resources, and where they're far from markets. We don't see measurable changes with any of these institutional design principles or with population. So let's go over the sort of the key highlights here. What are the things? Well, this is really the first empirical test over such a broad spatial scale of one of the most influential sort of ideas in common property studies, testing these sort of design principles. And what we find is that, well, it works, but not really in the way we expected it to, right? Remember, these were thought to create credible commitments that resource users would follow the rules. And what we're finding is, if anything, they have a small but negative influence on that. But they do have a strong influence on it having a positive impact on people's livelihoods. And I think the reason for this, my explanation for this, is the way that these design principles were initially developed. And that was by studying these long-enduring, successful co-management institutions. And my guess is that they were long-enduring because they were benefiting people's livelihoods, not only because they were creating conditions for compliance which led to resource sustainability, which I think was one of the key original thoughts of the pathway of why these things would be long-enduring. The second thing is that I think we've challenged a couple of key narratives here. One is this idea that people should just provide fishers with jobs and that's going to sort of solve the problem. I think what we found is that things are a lot more complicated and nuanced than that. Dependence on marine resources was positive for compliance, but negative for ecosystems conditions and whether it impacted people's livelihoods. And lastly, again, we're finding weak support for what I would call the simplistic Malthusian overfishing narrative. When we look at this over a broad spatial scale, what we're really finding is that coral reefs are complex social ecological systems that are influenced by things like wealth, markets, and dependence on resources. So with that, I would just like to thank my collaborators, such as Nick Graham and Tim and a number of other people, and thank the people that have funded this research, including the ARC, the Western Indian Ocean Marine Science Association, and National Geographic. Thank you.